America is currently in over $38 trillion of debt, and that's by no accident. As a matter of fact, it happened because certain laws were passed which enabled the debt to get to where it's at. And today in this video, we're going to go over the top 10 laws. We're doing a countdown. Yes, the top 10 laws that got us into the most debt. So let's jump right into it. Starting with number 10, the authorization for use of military force in 2001. President Bush signed just days after 9/11. This gave the president authority to pursue any group connected to the attacks with no time limit, no spending cap, and no exit strategy. Harvard researchers estimate the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq will cost between $4 and $6 trillion when you factor in veterans, healthcare, disability, military replenishment, and interest on borrowed war spending. The direct Pentagon spending alone hit $1.47 trillion by 2017. And here's what makes this uniquely brutal. Unlike every other major war in American history, Congress never raised taxes to pay for it. Not once. World War II had war tax. Korea had a war tax. This one, though, went straight on the national credit card, and we are still paying interest on it today. Now, number 9, Medicare Part D, the Medicare Modernization Act, which passed in 2003, signed by President Bush. This law created a prescription drug benefit under Medicare with no funding mechanism attached. Nothing. Congress passed over $1 trillion in future spending with zero plan to pay for it. The projected cost over 20 years exceeded $1 trillion, and every dollar was borrowed. The Bush administration's actuary, in other words, data analysis, later revealed he was threatened with termination if he released the real cost estimates before the vote. The bill passed by 5 votes. 5 votes. That is what $1 trillion in debt looks like. A 5-vote margin and a silenced accountant. Now, number 8, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, signed by Donald Trump. This law cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% permanently and temporarily reduced individual rates all across the board. It was sold as a growth engine that would pay for itself, but the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projected it would add $1.5 trillion in debt over the next 10 years. Independent economists put the real number closer to $2.9 trillion once you account for interest. The promised growth surge, though, never arrived at the scale needed to offset the lost revenue. Here's the part, though, that nobody talks about. The individual tax cuts are set to expire. The corporate cuts, though, are permanent. Guess which ones Congress keeps fighting to extend? This stuff is crazy. It's really no accident we're in this debt. All right, number 7, the Bush tax cuts. Let me read this to you. It's EGTRRA and GRTRRA. This was signed in 2001 and 2003 by President Bush. 2 rounds of tax cuts that happened at the start of the Bush administration, cutting rates across income levels, reducing capital gains taxes, and eliminating the estate tax. This was passed during a surplus. Let that sink in. We had a surplus and we still cut taxes. Direct cost was over $1.5 trillion in the first decade. Then Obama made most of them permanent in 2012, adding another $3.9 trillion in projected 10-year costs. These cuts were originally sold as temporary and targeted. They became permanent and structural, and both parties own this one. Republicans passed them, Democrats made them permanent. Number 6, the CARES Act and COVID relief packages in 2020 and 2021. This is on Trump and Biden. Stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment, business loans, PPP loans, vaccine distribution, emergency spending, which was really all emergency spending responding to a global pandemic. Now, you got to remember, when it comes to personal debt, a lot of personal debt is accrued because of emergencies that happen. So it's the same thing with nations. A lot of debt can be accrued when emergencies happen, even if you have the money, just because, you start freaking out and you just start making rash decisions. So keep that in mind. Now, the gross national debt grew by $4.5 trillion in Trump's final year and another $2.1 trillion in Biden's first year, almost entirely pandemic spending. That is the fastest accumulation of national debt in America history. And this was compressed into 24 months. To be fair, most economists agree some of this prevented a full economic collapse, but that doesn't make the numbers smaller. Still paying interest on every dollar of it. Here's the context that puts it in perspective. $6.5 trillion in 2 years is more than the entire national debt when Ronald Reagan left office in 1989. We added Reagan's full debt load in 2 years. Now, number 5, the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. This was signed by President Woodrow Wilson. This one doesn't have a direct dollar amount because it is structural, and that's exactly what makes it number 5 on this list. This law created the Federal Reserve System, giving the government the ability to manage the money supply, set interest rates, and finance unlimited government borrowing through bond issuance. Before the Fed, there was a hard limit on how much the government could borrow. Gold backing, in the absence of a lender of last resort, kept spending constrained. After the Fed, that constraint became theoretical. Every single law on this list, the wars, the tax cuts, the entitlements, was only financeable at the scale it happened because the Federal Reserve existed to backstop the borrowing. Wilson didn't add the debt directly. He built the machine that made all modern debt possible. And the original plan was drafted at a secret meeting in Jekyll Island in 1910. Bankers, senators, and financiers meeting in private to design the American banking system. That is not a conspiracy theory either. That is documented history in congressional records. Look it up. Now, number 4, the Economic Recovery Tax Act in 1981. This is President Ronald Reagan's signature legislation. So I always butcher that word. This cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% all the way down to 50%. And then the Tax Reform Act of 1986 cut it further to 28%. So think, we went from 70% down to 28% in just a few years. Now the theory was supply side economics. Cut taxes on the wealthy and businesses. The growth will trickle down to everyone else, and the revenue will take care of itself. The Economic Recovery Tax Act cost the federal government an estimated $2 trillion in lost revenue in just its first decade. The national debt tripled between 1982 and 1989, going from 1.1 trillion to 2.9 trillion. And this is in a time of peace with no world war, no Great Depression, just ideology. And the template Reagan set was copied by every Republican president who followed. The cuts always came. The promised growth never fully covered the gap. President Reagan campaigned on reducing the debt. One of his most famous lines was about piling deficit upon deficit and mortgaging our children's future. Then he signed the law that tripled it. His own budget director, David Stockman, later said the whole thing was a mistake. Reagan himself called the debt his greatest disappointment. His words, not mine. All right, it's getting juicy, so let's go. Number 3, the Social Security Amendments of 1972. Signed by President Nixon. This law massively expanded Social Security by tying benefits to inflation through automatic cost of living adjustments. He also expanded Medicare and Medicaid eligibility and created the Supplemental Security Income Program, all in one bill with almost no debate about the long-term costs. The total unfunded obligation for Social Security is now estimated at over $20 trillion over a 75-year window. Nixon didn't create Social Security or Medicare, but he supercharged them by making benefit growth automatic and permanent. No future president or Congress had to vote to increase No future president or Congress had to vote to increase Social Security on its own every single year forever. See, that one structural decision in 1972 is still expanding the debt right now as I am filming this. See, President Nixon is the sleeper pick on this entire list. Nobody connects him to the debt, but automatic COLAs mean Social Security costs more every year without a single vote being taken. He put the debt on autopilot, and nobody has been able to turn it off since. Okay, we're down to the final two. You ready? Can you guess what it is? All right, let's get it. Number 2, the Social Security Act signed in 1935 by FDR. See, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Social Security into law during the Great Depression, creating the first major federal entitlement program and establishing the principle that the federal government is permanently responsible for the financial security of its citizens. Social Security currently represents $2.7 trillion of the intergovernmental national debt right now. It costs over $1 trillion per year to operate and covers 65 million Americans. The program was designed for a completely different demographic reality. When it was created, most Americans died before or shortly after reaching retirement age. Now people live well into their 80s and 90s collecting benefits for decades. The math was never updated to match the reality though. And here is the wildest part of this entire video. The very first person to ever collect Social Security was a woman named Ida Mae Fuller. She paid $24.75 total into the program her entire working life. She lived to 100 years old and collected $22,889 in benefits. That is $925 in benefits for every single dollar she paid in. Now multiply that across 65 million people living longer than any generation in human history. That is the math problem nobody in Washington has the courage to solve. Before we get to number 1, if you haven't hit that follow or subscribe button yet, make sure you hit that right now. I put a lot of time and effort into this, so any support would be greatly appreciated. All right, now number 1, Medicare and Medicaid, the Social Security Act of 1965, signed by LBJ. See, Lyndon Johnson signed Medicare and Medicaid into existence in 1965, creating government-funded health care for seniors and low-income Americans. At the time, it was sold to Congress as a modest, manageable program that would cost around $9 billion a year by 1990. In 2024, Medicare alone costs $1.118 trillion. Medicaid costs another $931.7 billion. That's a combined over $2 trillion per year. That's over 24% of the entire federal budget. The entire U.S. defense budget is about $850 billion. Medicare by itself is now bigger than the entire defense budget. And sitting off the official books is another $38 trillion. The gap between what we have promised to pay in future Medicare and Medicaid benefits and what we have actually saved to cover those promises. That number does not show up on the debt clock, but it is a real commitment made to tens of millions of Americans. When Congress passed this in 1965, the projected cost was $9 billion a year by 1990. But the actual cost in 1990 was over $100 billion per year. Today, it is $2 trillion per year. The projection was off by a factor of more than 200. That is the single biggest fiscal miscalculation in the history of any government on earth. If your financial advisor was off by a factor of 200, you would fire them immediately. Congress signed this in 1965, and nobody has had the political courage to structurally fix it in 60 years. Not one president, not Congress, because the second you touch it, you will probably lose the next election. So there you have it. 10 laws that completely changed American history. And to be honest with you, there's little to no hope on fixing this because you would have to dismantle the entire system. And if you dismantle the entire system, then people are going to be very upset because they're going to lose out on the benefits that allow them to survive and, pay their bills. The only thing that you can possibly change in the system, from what I personally see, is raising tax on the wealthy. Obviously, look at the amount of money we lost whenever we lowered it from 70% on the top earners to 28%. That cost America a lot of money. So obviously, I mean, my thought would be just to fix that. But what are your thoughts? What do you think that we can do to get out of this hole, this debt hole that we're in? Or does it even matter? To me, the government just treats it like it really doesn't matter and just is just doing stuff at this point. So I would love to hear your thoughts and comments. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, follow, whatever it is on whatever platform you're seeing. I would really appreciate it. I dedicate a lot of time to my content, so I really appreciate the support that, everyone watching my videos, gives me. So thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.